A United States appeals court has found that the majority of President Donald Trump's tariffs are illegal. A number of countries, including South Africa, were slapped with what Trump termed reciprocal tariffs. Trump has slammed the ruling, saying it threatens to destroy the country. Now, to help us unpack the possible impact of this ruling, I am joined by Dr. Laurence Caromba, who is a researcher at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We all remember that day called, it was Liberation Day, when all those tariffs were imposed on an array of countries all over the world, taking shockwaves around the globe. What does this ruling now mean for all those tariffs?
Well, for now it means nothing, because the court that made the ruling specifically said that they would remain in place for the meantime if the Trump administration wishes to appeal, and they pretty much immediately said that they would be appealing, and that they considered this to be an illegitimate judicial usurpation of authority, and so they are appealing to the next highest court, which is the highest court in the United States, the Supreme Court, and that will have to definitively settle this issue. So until then, the economic situation remains unchanged. The picture for South Africa is the same as it was before, but there is perhaps a certain amount of hope that the U.S. Supreme Court will choose to uphold the appellate court's ruling, and that could see some of these tariffs struck down, which would generally be good for South Africa, because this trade policy of the Trump administration has been quite destructive for a number of South Africa's economic sectors.
And as you're mentioning as well, the Trump administration has indicated that they will be appealing this ruling, taking it to the Supreme Court. They've got until the 14th of October. But also this ruling is for not all of the tariffs, but the bulk of them. Which one doesn't it affect?
So it doesn't affect things like tariffs that the Trump administration put on certain other goods like steel. I think there's a whole range of tariffs under different U.S. laws. What are called the Section 301 tariffs, the Section 201. But so things like tariffs that are put in place on imported steel are done under national security justifications, and there are like specific tariffs against certain industries in China, and the tariffs on steel in particular are significant to us, because those ones unfortunately will continue regardless of what the Supreme Court decides on the so-called Liberation Day tariffs. So there's a broad sweeping set of tariffs that the U.S. has attempted to put in place under a whole range of domestic legal justifications, but the big ones are these these so-called reciprocal tariffs that were introduced on Liberation Day. And this affects our agribusiness sector and our automotive sector. So those are the sectors from a South African perspective that could get some relief if, again, the Supreme Court chooses to uphold the decision.
I mean, Dr. Caromba, 7 judges looked at this and said, look, under the U.S. Constitution, the president doesn't have powers to bypass Congress and go for such tariffs. And you're mentioning earlier that perhaps the Supreme Court might uphold what the other courts have already ruled on. Trump has already, as we know, criticized the court, criticized the ruling as well. Should this then be upheld by the Supreme Court and he doesn't adhere, is there a possibility of that? And should that happen, then what for countries like South Africa?
Well, I should say that I'm a political scientist, not a U.S. constitutional lawyer. But my plain English reading of the rationale of the appellate court, as well as the legislation that the Trump administration used to implement the tariffs, it definitely seems to me that the administration seems to be on shaky ground. The United States has a presidential system of government, which means that power is split between the president and the Congress. And one of the absolute core features of the U.S. system is that the Congress, the legislature, has the power of the purse, power over taxation and spending. And this is one of the very first things specified in the U.S. Constitution. In fact, the America became, famously independent as a country because they didn't like the fact that governments could impose taxes and tariffs without consulting the elected representatives of the people. So this is a core feature of the U.S. legal system. The Trump argument is that because in 1977, the Congress passed a law that said that government can, as a temporary measure, regulate trade policy in the case of things like a national security emergency. The government is allowed to impose sanctions, like in the context of a geopolitical crisis or a war or something like that. This law has been on the books for 50 years now, and no previous US president of any political party has ever tried to use that justification to impose tariffs. So if we simply go according to the law, it would seem as though there is a good chance that the appellate court decision would be upheld. But of course, law is also political, and the court system in a lot of cases has been reluctant to overturn the will of the president too strongly. In the U.S. system, I think there's been a real reluctance on the part of the Supreme Courts to to be seen as too strongly going against the will of the president and creating a possible conflict between the judicial branch and the executive branch of government. So there might be reasons why they choose to defer to the administration, and we definitely can't rule that possibility out. I think we as from a South African perspective, unfortunately cannot rely on the fact that courts will come to the rescue of our export industries.
So not out of the woodworks yet. Dr. Caromba, thank you so much for helping us unpack this.